Hello everyone. I have had the time to listen to the YouTube videos and do some reading on the AMD and Nvidia keynote slash CES stuff. I do have a few things to say regarding that. In order to do that properly, I should go over some information first, starting with OBS Studio slash Streamlabs OBS. OBS Studio, resource-wise, does better than Streamlabs OBS. For that reason, I have noticed that tends to be the recommendation is OBS Studio. I know it's not everybody's favorite, but it seems that that is the recommendation by a lot of the major tech channels. Regardless of what you choose, either one uses one of two encoding methods with streamers. That's going to be X264 or NVENC, which is Nvidia. X264 is CPU encoding, and NVENC is a custom encoding to Nvidia video cards. Out of the two, X264 tends to be the safer bet because of the fact that a lot of games use more GPU than CPU. There are rare exceptions, of course, like Control, which do use a lot of CPU, but other than Control and those rare exceptions, most games tend to be more GPU bound than CPU bound. For that reason, it's good to have X264 capability in the event you do run into some problems trying to run a game at max graphics or whatever it is you're trying to do. One other thing that should be noted with OBS Studio and or streaming is the technicalities of NVENC. I have actually talked to NVIDIA staff members in the past regarding NVENC to try and learn more about it. Some of the things that were said by the NVIDIA staff are things that people seem to not know about for the most part. I'll try my best to explain what the NVIDIA staff told me. NVENC is a separate chip on the video card, at least for the later generations. I don't know if it applies to the older generation. That was not mentioned in the conversation. I just know it's with the newer generation of NVIDIA video cards. But anyways, NVENC is a separate chip on the video card that has its own processing capability and does the encoding on its own. However, if at any point you downscale in resolution or you turn on other things like psycho tuning, then that NVENC chip will pull resources from the GPU itself. NVENC by default is set to 1080p streaming. That means if you go down 720p, 480p, or you even go up higher, 1440p, then it will take from the GPU itself. So, as mentioned, games are more GPU bound than CPU bound these days. That's why I was mentioning it's probably good to have X264 encoding as a backup solution in the event that you do run into that kind of issue. AMD Ryzen has been, well, up till recently, the best at X264 coding. I haven't looked at Alder Lake's benchmarks for that yet, but I know that prior to Alder Lake, the AMD Ryzen 5000 series was doing the best at X264 encoding. So we'll see if that remains the same, but generally speaking, if you compare an AMD Ryzen with an NVIDIA video card, that tends to be a very good combination for streaming. But moving on. The next thing that I want to go over is the AMD APUs. In my opinion, AMD APUs are a good thing for several reasons. One of the big reasons is for diagnostic reasons. If at any point you think that your video card has died, a great way to check to see if that is correct, then you can plug in your monitor to the motherboard to start drawing from the APU. That's actually one of the great things about it. I know there's been attempts to make software to better manage an APU working alongside a dedicated graphics card. I don't know if there's been any progress with that or what has happened, as I have not done any checking recently. However, if they have managed to make that software, then there are a lot of other possibilities that could happen, and I'll go over that with the 6500 XT here in a bit. But for now, I just kind of want to say that if that's the case, then it would be cool if APUs were a little bit better so that the APU could focus on the operating system and maybe some background apps so that the dedicated video card can focus on other things. That would be another major benefit besides diagnostic reasons for an APU. The problem is, while all this sounds good, APUs just don't have as good of an FPS count as their dedicated CPU counterparts. In this particular case, the AMD 5700G, if compared to a 5800X, can score as low as 100 FPS. That's really not good. If you're scoring 100 FPS less than a dedicated CPU, then that will present a whole bunch of issues down the road for a build. Generally speaking, a lot of people keep their gaming PCs for 3 to 5 years, if not more, depending on what it is. But generally speaking, it's going to be 3 to 5 years if you look at the insurance data or the other data that's available out there. So losing 100 FPS does limit how long that computer will last because, as time goes on, games get more demanding. It's a continual cycle. But yeah, so I do wish that APUs were better. That's what I'll go over now, and then I'll talk about the 6500 XT. Okay, so what I would like to see from AMD, and what I feel like is missing from all these keynotes or CES announcements, is just better APUs. I think the way they could make these APU better is to increase the TDP of it. If you'll notice, I've had the specs for the 5700G pulled up for quite a while now. You'll notice its TDP is 65 watts. I understand that efficiency is good and all, but if you're running a desktop APU, I think the TDP should be higher so that there's more power going to the CPU. I think that if an APU is going to be made for a gaming PC, it should be more focused on the CPU than the integrated graphics. The integrated graphics really shouldn't be to the level that it is right now, I don't think, because realistically, you're not going to use an APU to play any of the esport titles, maybe other than Counter-Strike. Therefore, the only thing an APU is good for is running the operating system and background apps, or being used as a diagnostic purpose. But other than that, I think that an APU should be more focused towards the CPU than integrated graphics. So I think that one way they could fix that is by increasing the TDP. I think that the TDP should be increased to at least 90 watts. Here's my reasoning for such an odd number. I know that in the past, CPUs have traditionally been 65, 95, then 125 watts. The reason I'm saying 90 watts is because it's at the outer edge or limit of graphene pads. I know graphene pads is a pretty rare cooling solution, but it is actually kind of nice to have with certain builds. Or if you're running a computer repair shop, it's nice to use graphene pads instead of thermal paste. So graphene pads can only go out to, I think at most the best graphene pad can run 95 watts. So keeping it at 90 would kind of help the graphene pad, but it would also make sure that the TDP is not going higher than some of the more compact coolers. I am a big fan of ITX and MATX builds, so I would very much like to see an APU that can work with those, and of course the graphene pads. That's just my personal take on it. If someone disagrees with that or thinks that something should be differently, that's your thing. Okay, to further this APU discussion, let me go ahead and deviate now to the 6500 XT. From what I understand between Gamers Nexus video and a couple other videos, is the 6500 XT is supposed to be the next budget video card for AMD. The problem is that it's missing some encoders, which makes it impossible to do video encoding, and I think it also makes it possible for Netflix if I understood Gamers Nexus correctly. If I did not, feel free to correct me in the comments. Now, if that's the case, this would be an excellent use case for the APU, because if an APU has the encoder and the dedicated graphics does not, then you can just use the integrated graphics for that instead of the dedicated graphics for Netflix and things like that, if that's the case. But that is assuming that the software is even good enough for that, and also, is it really worth it? Because as much as I want to root for AMD to have better video cards, I know that their drivers have been failing in comparison to Nvidia. They've been more of a hit and miss over the last couple of years than Nvidia has. Nvidia's not perfect either. They have certainly had some issue drivers over the years, so I'm not saying Nvidia's the golden one here, but I'm saying that out of the two, AMD's the one that's had more issues. So I do worry that the drivers may not be very good for the 6500 XT. And for that matter, a software made for the APU. So that combination alone might not work. Assuming that that was, well, assuming that route was even taken. My other concern is that the 6500 XT just won't do as good as the RTX 3050. But I guess time will tell. It's too early to really tell which one's going to be the better performer at the price point. And of course, another thing too that's going to factor into this is the overinflated market. I agree with Jay's 2 cents. You can safely assume that the $200 MSRP of the 6500 XT is really going to be $400 once it hits the market, and more than likely the 3050 is going to be $500, unfortunately. But yeah, again, we'll see where things go. While on the note of Nvidia, I do want to quickly deviate into the RTX 3050. I haven't noticed anything in terms of a new version of the 1660. So my guess is that the 1660 series is going to be gone and the 3050 is going to be taking its place. If that's the case, then that's going to be a pretty interesting change for Nvidia, because it sounds like to me that the GTX line is going to be gone within a generation or two, and everything's going to be moving to RTX. If that's the case, that's maybe going to be fine. I'll wait and see on that one. But yeah, I think that if you are going to be using a budget video solution for, let's just say, a TV PC, for example, then that should just be something for an APU to do. I don't think that you really need dedicated graphics for that. So I do think that the age of true budget dedicated video cards like RX 560, RX 570, or things like that is probably at an end. I think that at this point, a quote-unquote budget video card is going to be one for video gaming, because everything else is going to be handled by an APU, is where I think things are going at this current rate. But just like I said with the last section, we'll have to wait and see where things go. However, I'm very interested to see where things go, because like I said, it's a pretty big change for Nvidia. While on Nvidia, I do also want to quickly comment and agree with the other videos on the 3090 Ti and 3080 Ti. I absolutely despise the fact that Nvidia continues to do the whole Super and Ti thing. In some cases, Super, I think it is, could be Ti, I'm not entirely sure. I'll do some reading, but I think it's 5 to 10% better performance when you make that jump over the original or the plain version of those video cards. I really just don't think it's worth the time or the money to be making more Ti video cards or Super. I really think that NVIDIA should just focus on making more video cards and keeping the lineup pretty simple. I think that's where NVIDIA should be. And I think that the more they continue to do this, the more they send off a signal that they're being tone deaf. Because realistically, what we need right now in this current market, and potentially for future markets, is just more of the same video cards so that we have better availability on the shelves for everyone. I think that NVIDIA could just stick to an RTX 3050, 3060, 3070, and 3080, leave it at that. If there is a need for a workstation video card, then just make a workstation video card, but leave the 3080 to do the workhorse for the higher end video gaming. To further this, I would say NVIDIA should put a low priority on the 3080 because it really is a niche product. If you look at the statistics for the resolutions in gaming, you'll notice that 4K gaming is very low percent right now. 1440p is becoming more common as of late. It's certainly not going to rival the 1080p for quite a while because 1080p has been the most common gaming resolution to shoot for due to its low cost, and also as of recently for esports as well. Your 24-inch monitors is where you see those high refresh rates in certain models. I think it's up to 365 hertz now or something crazy like that. So yeah, 1080p is a very good goal for either budget or esports. 1440p is, in my opinion, a good middle ground for bigger resolution while maintaining good graphics at a decent cost. And then 4K is just unnecessary. It really is hard to get good hardware for that. And another thing too is it lowers the usability of that computer because, like I said in the prior section, according to the insurance statistics, warranty information, and some other stuff that's publicly available out there, people tend to keep their gaming computers for 3 to 5 years. If you're shooting for something as high-end as 4K, you're not really going to get 3 to 5 years out of that, more than likely. 1440p, you might be able to do it. 1080p, definitely. So, yeah, just make 3080 a low priority, put a higher priority on 3070, 3060, and 3050. That's all NVIDIA should focus on in my book. Quit with the Super and Ti. Okay, let me finish this recording by talking about one last thing. This wasn't really mentioned in the keynotes or CES, or really any mention at all, but I do want to quickly deviate to what I think AMD could do potentially for the future and start including it in their lineup. As mentioned, there are 2 encoding methods for OBS Studio, that's X264 and NVENC. I think AMD could be very successful in making their own type of encoding, perhaps a hybrid encoding that makes use of the APUs. If an APU from AMD had its own unique encoding, I think it could use a mixture of its integrated graphics and the CPU to make a really good encoder. One that probably is better on the resources during gaming than NVENC is. I think that's where AMD could potentially dominate another market, because right now they're dominating the market share for servers and laptops, but I think they could also dominate streaming because they control the best APUs right now. So if they took advantage of that, I think that we could be seeing new CES or keynote announcements in the coming years of them doing something like that. Certainly would be within their wheelhouse, assuming they have the resources to do it. That is one of the issues with AMD and why I think that they don't progress as quickly or as efficiently as some of the other brands. They just don't have the resources like the other brands do. Well, yeah, I guess resources is a good word for it. I was about to say money, but I guess resources is a good word for it. But yeah, because I know I've talked to AMD before about something similar to that. Not exactly them doing their own coder, but I have talked to them about their APUs before. and they told me that they just don't have the resources to handle that in terms of money, people to work on, and things like that. And I think that's probably going to still be an issue for them, but I think that if they could correct that issue, that could certainly propel them forward in that particular market. I think it would be worth it because streaming is really not a niche market anymore. There are tons of streamers now, not just on Twitch, but YouTube now. Facebook's getting in on the action, and a couple other names that I've probably forgotten by now. But there are certainly others out there that are trying to get into the streaming market. I think one's called Circle, if I remember right, but I'm not gonna bother trying to remember. But yeah, my point is that it really is something they could tap into. So yeah, that's really all I have to say on the topic. Thanks for listening.